This lesson today is talking about critical attributes of graphs. I want you to make sure that you do have your notebook set up in your Cornell notes. Make sure that you've included the topic in the upper left-hand corner and your essential question. So if you need to pause the video and set up your notes that way, if you would please do that. When we're talking about critical attributes of graphs, the things that we are talking about are slope, so identifying the slope, and another name for slope is also rate of change. So slope is what we call it when we're dealing with straight mathematical problems. We refer to it as rate of change when we're dealing with real-life examples or word problems. We also talk about our intercepts, X and Y intercepts, when we talk about the critical attributes. One thing I want you to know is that the X-intercept can also be called the zeros of your graph, and that's a really important vocabulary to know, and we'll refer to that again when we talk about other types of functions. And then of course we can also talk about whether it's continuous or discrete, and work with it that way and identify the domain and range. So let's look at this first example. We have a graph, and the first thing I've asked you to do is determine the slope. Remember, there's two different ways we could determine the slope from this graph. One way would be to draw a right triangle and determine the slope that way with the height over the base, or we could use the formula. Y minus y over x minus x. Right here, if you look at this point, it's not labeled it, but I think it's pretty obvious that this point is 0, 5. This point right here is 5, 0. So whether we draw a right triangle or whether we use our formula, I think we could see that the slope of this line is -1. If you're not sure about that, pause the video and take the time to actually calculate it. The next question, number 2, says what does the slope of this line represent? So when it says represent and we're looking at a graph that's actually labeled, we need to read our axes. Remember, slope, the y always goes on top, the x is on bottom. So if we read our y-axis, it says the amount of water, or gallons. So we could and then on the x-axis it says time, or hours. So we could say that our slope represents gallons per hour. So that's what we're saying when it's asking, when it says what does it represent. Number 3 says what is the y-intercept and what does it represent? Well, here's our y-intercept where it crosses the y-axis. The y-intercept is 5. Well, in terms of this problem, what does it represent? It represents that there are 5 gallons at 0 hours. Or you could say that we begin with 5 gallons. Either way would be a way to interpret this. The next question says, what is the x-intercept and what does it represent? Here is our x-intercept. It is at 5, 0, and it represents that at 5 hours there is 0 gallons left. Or we could say that it's when our tank is empty. If we're talking about a tank of something or a bucket, our bucket is empty at 5 hours. Now this is a bad question. This has nothing to do with, this graph has nothing to do with money, so I'm going to change it. And so my question is, if we started with 10 gallons. If we started with 10 gallons, how would that change the graph? What would the graph do? I want you to think about that and write down your answer. If we started with 10 gallons, how would the graph change? And what about if the rate of change was -2 gallons per hour? How would the graph change? How would it look different, or would it not look different? Would it be the same? What would happen in this situation? That's all we're going to look at on this notes together. What I'd like you to do is now read the bottom situation and see if you can answer those questions on your own, and we will talk about them in class.